In art, genius and suffering have often gone hand in hand. But for Paul Rubens, professional achievement combined with lifelong personal happiness. A brilliant scholar, he was also a man of such charm that he worked with great success as a diplomat. But, more than anything, he was an artist of the highest rank, a prodigious painter whose influence has spanned the centuries. It is Rubens' huge body of work that makes him possibly the greatest of all the Dutch and Flemish masters. In 1566, in the Flemish city of Antwerp, Protestant riots broke out against Spanish hereditary rule. Outraged, King Philip of Spain moved to crush the rebellion. By 1579, there existed a clear distinction between Protestant Holland to the north and Catholic Flanders to the south. One wealthy citizen of Flemish Antwerp, who reflected the turmoil of the times, was Jan Rubens. Originally a Catholic, he had become a Protestant only to flee when King Philip's forces attacked in 1568. He moved to the German city of Cologne, where he reconverted to Catholicism and worked as legal advisor to the Princess of Orange. 3 years later, following an adulterous affair with the princess, Jan Rubens was exiled to the town of Siegen. 10 years later, Rubens Sr. died, and his widow now returned to Antwerp with her 3 remaining dependent children, Philip, Peter Paul, and a daughter, Blandina. Back in Antwerp, there was no doubt about the youngest son's religious identity. Paul Rubens was raised as a Catholic, and his devotion to the Roman Church would remain with him throughout his life.
Antwerp is a Catholic city, therefore he belonged to the right religion. He knew all the right people, the church, members of the church and rulers of the city, and therefore that immediately brought him into contact with them. And naturally, when all the major commissions came up, he was the prime candidate for being given the job.
His religious beliefs had an enormous effect on both his life and his work. He lived a moderate and respectable life. In his paintings, he's trying to put over the Catholic Orthodox view of religion, and his paintings were meant to be seen as aids to prayer and also meditation, and to reinforce belief as well.
Clearly, he is one of the great interpreters of the Counter-Reformation. And yet, if you think about him if you're thinking about his personal belief, one thinks that he is really a man who thought more broadly than just within a denominational framework of Catholicism.
One might really say that Rubens would not have become a painter had he not been a Catholic. And that's a pretty huge thing to say, given his importance to the history of art.
By the end of the 1590s, Rubens' professional destiny was also clear. At the age of 11, he attended Verdonk's school near Antwerp's Gothic cathedral, where he began a lifelong love affair with classical literature. But his real passion was already clear: painting. Still in his early teens, he was apprenticed to a local landscape artist, Tobias Verhecht. He then spent 4 years with the portraitist Adam van Noort, before moving on in 1596 to work in the studio of Antwerp's best-known painter, Otto van Veen, who had studied in Italy and had renamed himself Octavius Venius. It was van Veen who introduced Rubens to engravings of great Italian Renaissance paintings, and in 2 of the earliest surviving works by Rubens, we can clearly identify this influence. Adam and Eve in Paradise and Judgment of Paris were both inspired by the work of the great Raphael. By this time, Rubens was established as a painter in his own right, but he knew he had to experience the Italian masters directly. So, in May 1600, at the age of 22, he left Antwerp and headed south. 2 months later, he arrived at his Italian destination, Venice. In the 16th century, Venice had been the home of some of the greatest painters of the Renaissance. Artists of the caliber of Giorgione, Titian and Veronese had evolved a wonderfully vibrant approach to light and colour, with a freedom of brushwork quite different from the great Florentine masters of the age. The young Rubens especially appreciated the Titians on display in Venice. It was an admiration he would never lose.
He particularly was interested, first of all, the colour. This wonderful sense of colour Titian has, a much richer, more vibrant than other artists. And secondly, the way that Titian actually painted, this very free use of the paintbrush, so that you can actually watch the strokes as the artist builds up a particular area in the picture. And also the sense of light that permeates throughout Titian's paintings.
We know that he copied paintings after Titian, and we know too that Rubens was particularly taken by Titian's Great Assumption in the Friary Church in Venice. It's a monumental display of colour and action.
I think it was subject matter was interesting for Rubens in Titian. Colour, of course, was very interesting for him. But I think he has a profoundly different style of painting. And so this kind of modelling in tones, which is so characteristic of Titian, is not really a style that Rubens wholeheartedly takes up. In the 1630s, he's much closer to Titian than he is earlier in his career.
Not long after arriving in Italy, Rubens secured a position as court painter to the Duke of Mantua. But, as a young man, his passion was to fully learn his art. To do that, he needed to travel to the greatest centre of Italian artistic achievement, the city of Rome. Rubens was thrilled when, in 1601, he arrived in Rome for the first time. Here, he spent a great deal of time drawing classical sculpture in particular. In many of his later paintings, the ancient source of his figures can clearly be seen. He was also able to study more of the art of the High Renaissance, with Michelangelo and Raphael just two of the artists that inspired him. But he also appreciated more contemporary work, including the paintings of Caravaggio and Caravaggio. At the time, these artists were reacting against the artificialities of mannerism that had characterized much of the painting of the late 16th century. They sought a new artistic approach, in which the greatest legacies of the High Renaissance were combined with a new naturalism in figure depiction. It would become known as the art of the Baroque.
Rome was a site of moving forward, and the two principal artists, or the two principal sort of positions, perhaps more than artists in Rome, when Rubens visited Rome at the beginning of the 17th century, were Caravaggio and the Carracci brothers and cousin, so the Carracci school.
Carracci was seen as the person that had regenerated Italian art after the excesses and artificialities of mannerism. Annibale Carracci put art back onto a real and naturalistic footing. Caravaggio, of course, was one of the artists who gave new readings of biblical subjects. He gave them dynamism, he gave them interest as well. And it's from Caravaggio that Rubens learns about lighting and also about how animating groups and making spectators become involved in a subject.
Rubens' work is typical of the Baroque in the way that it is very dynamic We have this tremendous sense of energy, this very unified message or subject that he's putting over, and this reliance on naturalism in the actual way he paints figures.
He's a great storyteller. I mean, and this surely is also a feature of Baroque painting. It's a painting that impresses the viewer, the Counter-Reformation Catholic, with the drama, the truth, the story of the saints and, of course, of the life of Christ himself.
Rubens' first visit to Rome lasted some 8 months. In that time, he not only soaked up the exciting art of the city, but began to make his own contribution to it. But in early 1603, the Duke of Mantua presented Rubens with a very different kind of task: to travel to Spain to present gifts to King Philip III. By selecting his court painter to make the presentation, the Duke was acknowledging Rubens' already evident charm, the charm of the diplomat.
Artists had been diplomats for a very long time. Rubens isn't the first one to be a diplomat. I think what's different about Rubens is the level of diplomatic activity that he was engaged in. He was really functioning at a high level, at a sort of, I suppose we might say, ambassadorial level.
Rubens was a very self-assured man. He really knew, well, he knew his own worth, and he was extremely widely educated. He was really a rather worldly man compared with a lot of artists. He had great charm, and I'm sure he conveyed a sense of reliability that any ruler wanting someone to act as their diplomat impressed. There was already, I think even in his earliest days, was an aura about him that would impress not only his contemporary artists, but also those in power.
His native language was Flemish, but he could also speak Spanish, French, Latin, which was spoken amongst scholars at that time, and his favourite language of all was Italian. Now, Italian was the diplomatic language, so that's obviously very useful to have. And he always signed himself in Italian. He signed himself Pietro Paolo Rubens.
Sadly for Rubens, his first diplomatic mission suffered difficulties from the start. Amongst the gifts for the Spanish king were a number of paintings, copies of great works by Titian and Raphael. But during the long journey to Spain, which included a sea passage, the canvases were badly damaged by rain. Reluctantly, Rubens retouched them, but his results were nonetheless well received. But this entirely original portrait made a better impression still. This is the Duke of Lerma, the strongest figure in the Spanish court, nobly depicted on his white stallion. It was a canvas which impressed its subject, and Rubens' Spanish expedition widened his already extensive network of contacts. Back in Rome, he created this altarpiece for the new church of the Oratorian priests, a work which impressed the artist himself.
History Hit is a streaming platform that is just for history fans, with fantastic documentaries covering fascinating figures and moments in history from all over the world. We aim to bring you only the most dramatic and fascinating stories of the past through our award-winning documentaries. Find out about the rise of leaders such as Cleopatra and Napoleon in our latest offering of exclusive documentaries. Sign up now for a free trial, and Perspective fans get 50% off their first 3 months. Just be sure to use the code PERSPECTIVE at checkout.
This second Roman stay was a happy time for Rubens, living with his brother Philip and enjoying the artistic and intellectual life of the city. Philosophy was one of the many subjects that interested him, and it is clear that the classical school of Stoic philosophy held a particular appeal for him.
His philosophical beliefs are about modesty, about virtue, and about constancy, the virtue of constancy. They're linked with an important philosophical movement both in Italy, throughout Europe really, in the later 16th century and earlier 17th century, which is called Neo-Stoicism.
Now, Neo-Stoicism was the reconciling of Christianity with the moral virtues of antiquity. And the most learned Neo-Stoic philosopher was a man called Justus Lipsius, and we know that Rubens' brother was a pupil of his. And so Rubens is very interested in leading a moral life based not only on Christianity, but also on the teachings of people like Tacitus.
The two aspects of Neo-Stoic belief that he was particularly influenced by were the controlling of one's emotions and the acceptance of fate. These were two aspects of life you just had to face up to and accept.
Rubens was keen to absorb the ideas of classical times, but he was also keen to collect the physical relics of the ancients. By the time he left Rome in July 1607, he had already established a collection of Roman sculptures, coins, and other antiquities. That month, he travelled to the wealthy city of Genoa with his employer, a journey that produced more useful contacts. He painted many wealthy Genoese citizens during his visit, including this canvas depicting Giovanni Carlo Doria. Genoa was a world where image and prestige mattered. As with the portrait of Lerma, it invests the mounted figure with a sense of grandeur, but retains the sense of life and energy of an important citizen. By 1608, Rubens was again in Rome, completing the new church altarpiece. But on the 27th of October that year, he received a grave communication from his home city. His mother was seriously ill. He left Italy at once, but it was too late. Rubens now had to decide whether to stay in Flanders or return south. His mind was made up by a generous offer from the Catholic regents of the Netherlands, Archduke Albert and Infanta Isabella. On a salary of 500 florins a year, he became their court painter. Peter Paul Rubens was back in Antwerp. It was a good time to return. The city had suffered badly from the blockage of its port access by the Protestant United Provinces of Holland to the north. But a 12-year truce was now in force. The port was reopened, and the local economy began to recover. There were also strong personal reasons for Rubens to return. In 1609, he married 19-year-old Isabella Brandt. From the start, it was a happy marriage, and when Rubens sought to depict himself with his new bride, sitting beneath a honeysuckle bower, the result was this famous double portrait, one of the most enduring visual celebrations of marital happiness ever created.
There were very few portraits, self-portraits with spouses in the history of art, one or two in the north. But this was a new type of portrait. It's also on a very large scale. It's about 5 foot high. And it's wonderfully real. It's the way the contact you have with the sitters. You feel this is a modern marriage, might have taken place yesterday. The touching way she sits at his feet with their hands joined. It's so direct. One is transfixed by this image of a very happy couple.
The honeysuckle bower portrait, I think, is all about trust and fidelity. He arranges it by a lot of interlocking shapes, so there's this sense that the two depend on one another. The honeysuckle was an emblem of love, and by clasping hands, they suggest fidelity as well. What's also interesting about the portrait is that you would never think that this is an artist and his wife. So Rubens shows himself holding a very richly jewelled sword hilt. He's showing himself off as, if anything, a courtier. And Rubens liked to have this image of a gentleman artist about him.
In 1610, he bought a house on a patch of land in an affluent area of the city and began to extend his home there, with a substantial area devoted to space for his ever-growing collection of antiques. Supervision of the construction was almost a work of art in itself. But Rubens did not neglect his formal painting duties. These portraits of Archduke Albert and the Infanta Isabella represent his first commissions for his new employers. Once again, he succeeded in capturing the dignity of nobility, but without neglecting individual personality, in these striking images with their vivid red sunset background. For Flemish painters of religious images, the second decade of the 1600s was an often profitable time. Major works commissioned for many of Antwerp's churches, with Rubens the recipient of many of these commissions. Over the course of the decade, he produced a large number of altarpieces to establish himself as the greatest religious painter of his age. In his Raising of the Cross, completed in 1611, we can immediately identify Jesus' humanity in what is a profoundly spiritual work. But it is the overall layout of the altarpiece that is, perhaps, more interesting. The action and drama fills the canvas from bottom right to top left, and the figures raising Christ are seemingly combined in a unified mass, individual components subordinate to the whole. This trademark Baroque effect can also be seen in The Descent from the Cross, completed in 1614. Here the scene is almost mirror image, as the dead Jesus is taken down. This panel presents a sense of movement, but it is a mournful movement. The significant event, the crucifixion, has already taken place. Both these remarkable paintings also reveal Rubens' passion for the sculptured images of the antique.
Rubens was extremely interested in classical antiquity, and of course one of the principal reasons he wanted to go to Italy, and one of the principal reasons why he wanted to spend as much time as possible in Rome, so he moved very soon from Mantua down to Rome, was to study the great collections of antiquity in Rome in the early 17th century.
One of the things he said, that when you are influenced by an antique sculpture, the resulting work mustn't smell of stone. And this is what's so good about Rubens' painting, because you can always, or nearly always, identify the particular sculpture he's used, but they are transformed into his own language. And there were several very well-known antique sculptures he used, particularly the Laocoon, which was done for any subject with suffering in it, the Farnese Hercules for strength, St. Christopher on the outer side of one of the great altarpieces, the Descent from the Cross, has a figure of St. Christopher which is based on the Farnese Hercules.
Rubens painted enduring religious images throughout the 1610s. But these were not the only commissions Rubens received at the time. He also painted many mythological scenes, such as Ganymede and the Eagle. Here, it is perhaps the eagle, rather than Ganymede, who holds our attention. Rubens was certainly a master of painting animals, and he was often in demand to paint the hunting scenes which were popular at the time. The lion hunt is a classic example of the genre. Again, we are presented with a unified, swirling mass of life, with the ferocity of the great cats memorably executed.
There's nobody really to rival Rubens in the 17th century. Even in Italy, there are people that can't compete with this vibrant energy and life that he manages to put into paintings. I think the greatest example of the secular Baroque, if you like, the non-religious Baroque, is Rubens' Lion Hunt. So we've got this terrific, almost explosion of energy taking place in the painting. Right in the centre of the painting, the lion is sinking its teeth into a horse. We've also got these great diagonals that again add to the movement and instability in the painting. And we're also not sure who's going to win this battle. Even if the lions are going to be killed, they're giving a pretty good account of themselves.
Rubens' huge output would have been beyond the abilities of any man to achieve completely single-handed. Instead, he was the head of a large studio, a classically influenced building across the courtyard from his home. It was certainly a thriving establishment. As many as 100 artists may have worked there, but not in the typical master and pupil sense. Clearly, Rubens could not have taught so many. Instead, the Rubens Studio was more like a Rubens factory. Some artists were employed to carry out the most mundane tasks, such as grinding the paint. Others, such as the young Anthony van Dyck, were given more responsibility, with Rubens himself finishing off the final layers of the work. More established artists were employed as named collaborators. In this 1612 canvas depicting Prometheus, the eagle is the work of his associate, Franz Schneiders. The Antwerp studio was a well-organized system, with the artist very much in charge. In addition to his other talents, Rubens now revealed his skill as an administrator.
I like to think of Rubens as either like a film director, so that he's the orchestrator of lots and lots of other people working, or the kind of director of a factory, so to think about him as Rubens Limited. And it's so imagine that you've got a brand name called Rubens, and you've got to stamp that brand name on works that look like Rubens, so that it's a particular style or mode of representation or mode of painting, a style of painting that is recognisably Rubens, but not necessarily all by Rubens's hand.
Rubens had far more work than he can ever cope with, so he has to have almost a production line working. It's correct to speak about Rubens and company, I think. So he gathers around him not so much pupils, he wasn't that interested in teaching, but people who could assist in the production process.
What he did essentially is make sketches rather like those behind me here, which he would hand over to a member of the studio to work up into to large canvases or large panels, and then he would finish them off himself. I mean, in a way it wasn't a very complicated system.
Paintings that every brushstroke was by himself were valued much more highly. And there's a celebrated letter to Sir Dudley Carleton offering various pictures, and each one is described, whether it's by himself entirely or with assistant or pupils which he's retouched, and the prices are attached, so you can see very clearly how Rubens valued his own contribution.
By 1620, Rubens' fame spread far beyond Antwerp. The technique of engraving took his works to the widest possible audience. But his fame never seems to have affected him. His lifestyle is recorded as being one of sober routine. According to one contemporary, he rose at 4 in the morning, celebrated Mass every day, and avoided the perils of drink, while maintaining the widest possible range of interests.
He's not one of these artists that sat around waiting for inspiration to come. He was always working. One record of a visit to his studio says that they came across Rubens and he was working, he was dictating a letter, and he was having some of the books of Tacitus read to him at the same time.
He was a great reader, enormously knowledgeable. I mean, his knowledge of classical literature and the very wide subjects was very remarkable. And he liked to sit with friends and look at coins in the evening. It was a sober, well-regulated life.
In the early 1620s, Rubens completed, on time, no less than 39 ceiling paintings for Antwerp's new Jesuit Church. Sadly, they were destroyed by fire in 1718, but many of the preliminary works survive. This panel, depicting the Last Supper, shows the steep angle required for an effective ceiling painting. Surviving preparatory panels or modelli, such as this, give us an insight into how Rubens went about creating his finest works.
Rubens never followed any one particular procedure, but I think one could say a typical way he went about it would be, first of all, to make a sketch of the composition in pen and ink, which he would then do an oil sketch, a modello we call it.
Once he'd established the general lines of a composition, he could pass them on to his studio. They understood what he wanted. They would do a lot of the work. He would then have the final say and retouch anything that required retouching.
Shortly after Rubens had successfully completed the ceiling paintings for the Jesuit Church, the European political situation began to change. 1621 saw the death of the King of Spain, Philip III, the end of the 12 years' truce, and, in July, the death of Rubens' patron, Archduke Albert. Albert's widow, Isabella, now appointed Rubens as her special envoy, hoping that his connections would prove useful in the intrigue-filled political negotiations of the time. For the next 9 years or so, much of Rubens' time was taken up with diplomacy.
He got more involved in a much bigger diplomacy and was sent to London, where he resided for 9 months, where he got involved in treaties between England, France and Spain.
This is the first stage in those 17th century diplomatic negotiations. You had to agree to an exchange of ambassadors. And what Rubens does in that visit is set up an exchange of ambassadors.
He didn't come as the representative of Spain, he came as the representative of the Spanish Netherlands. But of course he had all his orders issued to him directly from Madrid. We know that he got on very well with Charles. Charles was the greatest art collector of the day. And so Charles thought it an honour to himself to meet such a great artist.
Rubens' diplomatic efforts would ultimately prove successful, but we know he grew frustrated at the sheer amount of time that they consumed. Before completing his work for the Jesuit Church in Antwerp, he had expressed a desire to take on even more ambitious commissions. In January 1622, he was summoned to Paris by Maria de Medici, widow of Henry IV, and mother of the young King Louis XIII. She commissioned a series of 24 paintings depicting events from her own life to be installed in the Luxembourg Palace. One of her courtiers told her that it would take 2 Italian artists 10 years to carry out the task. Rubens, he said, would do it in 4. In fact, he completed the commission in 3, a remarkable achievement since Madame de Medici's desires were as much political as artistic.
The first cycle, which was one that was actually completed, was devoted to, I think it was described as the glorious life and heroic deeds of the Queen. Well, I'm afraid there was nothing glorious or heroic about her life. And so it was a very skillful adaptation of certain incidents in her life, which were dressed up in allegory to give them a much greater impact. And this is what we see today. But when you look behind the actual event it records, you can see that it's a pretty mundane occasion, or sometimes something that was not perhaps as glorious as she might have hoped for.
In this, The fourth canvas in the cycle, Rubens depicts King Henry IV first encountering the face of his future queen, who is undeniably the central figure. The portrait is held by Hymen, god of marriage, and Cupid, god of love, and Henry is obviously love-struck. But the whole story is entirely fictitious. The marriage had nothing to do with love, and everything to do with politics. And the Medici Cycle made some political figures suspicious. Politics did not really interest Rubens, despite being surrounded by it. He once said that he was entirely dispassionate about everything except his own life and work. Remarkably, Rubens was able to turn his attentions to other works, even as he worked at the Medici Cycle. This delightful double portrait of his two sons, Albert and Nicholas, is an undeniably affectionate depiction, a study in boyhood, especially emphasized by the illumination of the older son, Albert. For an artist inspired by Titian, Rubens' mastery of light is unsurprising, and can also be seen in this portrait of Helena Foreman, a depiction of a friend's wife from the early 1620s. One of the best-loved of all Rubens' portraits, it captures not only the sitter's feminine modesty, but the sheer freshness of her skin tone, almost rococo in its colouring.
He was a great colourist. He changed in the course of his life. At first, strong local colours contrasted one with another. Gradually he modified this so there was much greater contrast between one colour and another. He tended to choose 2 or 3 basic colours which were the pattern for a particular picture, and therefore you get maybe a red of the costume, which will then be picked up in other parts of the composition, the same with blue and same with yellow and so on.
What you often find in Rubens as well is they get more than one source of light. So it's not just one light source, you might get multiple light sources, and that's done to emphasise objects and give them more prominence.
In June 1626, his wife Isabella died. The plague arrived in Antwerp in August 1625, and this may have been the cause of her death. The loss of his wife filled Rubens with a desire to travel, to get away from Antwerp. Until 1630, his political work achieved this objective for him. By March of that year, the efforts of Rubens the Diplomat had succeeded in brokering a peace between England and Spain, resulting in a knighthood for the painter from the English King Charles, an unparalleled honour for a painter. Peter Paul Rubens was now known in the highest circles across Europe. He was also now an extremely wealthy man, having sold the majority of his antique collection to the English nobleman, the Duke of Buckingham, here drawn by Rubens himself. When he returned to England in 1630, he was, in modern terms, the highest of high achievers. His life was a catalogue of success, all achieved through his own effort and genius.
He had enormous success, and he, of course, his work was sought after throughout Europe. I mean, he painted for the King of Spain, he painted for the King of England, he painted for the Queen Mother of France, as well as innumerable aristocratic clients, I mean, throughout Europe. So he really is an absolutely leading figure in Northern Europe by the early 1630s.
He returns to Antwerp after quite a long period abroad in England and Spain, and also having been in France. And he buys a country residence. So, like, you know, generation after generation of successful businessmen, basically, he puts his money into land and goes and lives the life of a country gentleman.
He was courted by kings in a way that almost no other painter was treated. He was very wealthy, he had a very happy family life, a second wife. It was really a life of tremendous success and fulfillment.
Back in Antwerp, Rubens understandably sought to put his political life behind him and return full-time to his art. Only the fact that he was a widower could now blight his happiness. But by the end of 1630, that was no longer the case. In December, he married Helena Foreman, sister of Susanna, the young woman he had painted some years before. Rubens was now 53 years of age. His new bride was 16. In 10 years of marriage, 5 children resulted. The last conceived just 1 month before the artist's death. But in this intriguing panel from 1631, the happy couple can be seen with the artist's son, Nicholas, from his first marriage. Perhaps Rubens deliberately decided to emphasize the figure of his beautiful young bride, while he himself seems to peep out apologetically from behind her. It is hardly surprising that Helena would be the subject of many of Rubens' later portraits. The early 1630s saw Rubens engaged in more ambitious projects, notably the ceiling decoration for the banqueting house in London's Whitehall. Commissioned during Rubens' stay in England, and finally delivered in 1635, these 9 canvases use allegorical devices from the Bible and mythology to celebrate a recent political event: the accession of King James of Scotland to the throne of England, and thus the uniting of 2 countries under his apparently enlightened rule. The coronation of James' successor and son, Charles I, is also depicted, and the British king was delighted with Rubens' achievement. 1635 also saw Rubens purchase the castle of Steen in the Flemish countryside, and for the remainder of his life he spent an increasing amount of his time there, surrounded by a family who now provided much of the inspiration for his work. He was now increasingly afflicted by gout, and increasingly he chose to avoid the city and work in the country where he now lived. The result was a remarkable series of landscapes. These were not the first of Rubens' works in the genre, but now he had the time to explore fully the light and colour of Flemish outdoor life. The sense of unification that he brought to his figure compositions was now invested in a timeless series of landscapes by an artist already almost 60. In the 19th century, the English landscapist John Constable stated his view that these images represent Rubens' greatest achievement.
In my view, these pictures were painted as a decorative scheme for one of the principal rooms in the Chateau d'Estaing. In a way, Rubens could sit in this room in his house and look, as it were, into the pictures, into the landscape that was around him.
One of the most remarkable things is that the landscape, particularly from the northern tradition, was divided into 3 parts. You had the foreground, which was largely brown, the middle ground, which was largely green, and then the background was blue. You could see each division quite clearly in previous landscapes. Rubens was a tremendous sweep. You start in the foreground and end up in the horizon before you know what's happened to you. And he broke down those barriers so that at the same time he had this ability to direct your eye through every part of the landscape.
It's interesting that Rubens shows it with undulating landscape. The landscape goes up and down, it's quite hilly. That's not true. The area around the Chateau of Stain is quite flat. There are various elements within it. We see a hunter and his dog pursuing game. We also see a farmer and his wife going off to market, and the Chateau of Stain itself in the top left. And the sky is cut by a pair of magpies. Everything in this painting adds up towards a kind of idyllic rural life. If you like, it's a hymn to the pastoral.
Sadly, by 1640, the creator of these timeless scenes was increasingly stricken by attacks of gout, and the end of Rubens' remarkable life was drawing near. It was possibly as late as 1640 that he chose to paint one of the very few self-portraits of his career. Many have seen this canvas as Rubens' final statement to the world. If it could be translated into words, it might say, "All my life I have fulfilled the potential given to me by God. I am a man of high status because I have earned that status. My earthly days are now approaching their end, and I leave my life's work to posterity." On May the 30th, 1640, Peter Paul Rubens died. There have been few, if any, artists who have achieved so much in both working and personal lives. In his lifetime, he was recognized as one of the greatest geniuses to ever pick up a brush. The subsequent centuries have done nothing to alter that recognition. Perhaps only Rembrandt can rival Rubens for the title greatest of the Dutch masters.
Rubens is the greatest of all 17th century artists, I think. Nobody was painting with the same vigour, vitality and understanding of the drama of human life.
He brought a new style, dynamic style of painting to Flanders. It was painting of, we realised, very high quality indeed. He painted in all kinds of different fields, no one particular subject.
Rubens was the most important artist working in the northern Europe in the first half of the 17th century. Admired throughout Europe, admired in Madrid, admired in Rome, admired in Paris, admired in London. I mean, he has a huge international reputation. And he's famous really for religious painting. I mean, essentially, he's interesting as a portraitist, he's interesting as these very private works of landscape, but essentially as a great religious painter is what he's particularly, and a great decorative painter of great decorative schemes. The Mary de' Medici series, this great series of allegorical paintings of the life of Mary de' Medici, the decorations for the banqueting hall ceiling in London, and so on. So great decorative undertakings and great altarpieces. I mean, this is the great achievement of Rubens.
Rubens exercised an enormous influence, I think, mostly in France. Painters like Watteau, painters like Boucher, but I think the greatest influence is on Delacroix, the great romantic artist. Delacroix also wrote and thought a lot about Rubens as well, and he always called Rubens the king of painters.